Today's video takes another look at this big book that I saw at the National Archives in London. In the previous video, where we looked at flogging in Hong Kong, but today we're interested in another report from this volume written by Mr Chadwick in 1882. Now, he visited Hong Kong to investigate the state of its sanitation, so his report covers sewers, housing, disease, and lots more beyond. Here it is, Mr Chadwick's reports on the sanitary condition of Hong Kong with appendices and plans. And it's those appendices and plans that first caught my attention, because a few pages into the report, there's just this little flash of colour that stands out. It's actually a folded up map of Hong Kong in 1882. Here it is. If we open it up, you can see it's going to be in several sections. So what I did is take these pictures of the different sections, brought them back home, and then used a little piece of free software called Huggin to reassemble them and then create the full map. And then the final step was to go back to Gulo, and on our maps page I've added that. So if you come over to the selector here, let's turn off the markers, and you choose the 1882 map. So this is the map overlaid, so we can easily match anything on this map up with the modern day layout of Hong Kong. He's marked three things on it. He's marked sewers with the red lines, he's marked public latrines with an L in a circle, and he's also marked the police stations around Hong Kong. So I was interested in it just as a useful map of Hong Kong. We don't have many from this time, but the report has got lots more of interest to us as well. To start with then, it's got plans of houses in Hong Kong, and that's exciting because although we've got lots of photos of Hong Kong in the 1880s, here's an example. So if I choose that decade and let's look at all of them, we've got several hundred to view. However, very few of them show the terraced houses where the bulk of Hong Kong's population lived, and even when they do, all we get to see are the roofs. Now these pictures are very detailed, so we can zoom in, but all we get then is a better view of the roof. We don't actually get to see what the houses look like, and we certainly don't get any views inside the houses. So Chadwick to the rescue, as his report includes cross-sections of a variety of houses. We start with number 2, Kai Ming Lane, which I thought was going to be somewhere around Tai Ping San, but looking at the map, he's marked Kai Ming Lane, and it was over in today's Admiralty District. Here it is here. So it's on the south side of Queen's Road. That's Queensway today. So Kai Ming Lane along here, very close to the High Court today. Looking at the cross section, you can see that each building had 2 floors. There was a shop downstairs, and upstairs Chadwick describes them as cabins. So there are these wooden partitions splitting the upstairs into even smaller rooms. There's also a wooden platform here with a space above, which was known as the cockloft. At the back, we've got the cookhouses, and then at the back of that, there is the dividing wall with the next row of houses built back to back with us. Very little light, very little ventilation. We've got 2 windows at the front here. At the back, there's no chimneys. There's just a hole in the ceiling here and a hole in the roof here, and that's to let the smoke from the cooking escape. Here's the front elevation, again with the shop and the 2 windows above, and also a note from the Chadwick saying that on the first floor lived 5 families, a total of 16 people, so quite crowded. Here's the view from above, just giving a better idea of how the floor was split up into the 3 cabins. Now our next plan shows much larger, more complicated buildings along East Street. These buildings were in Tai Ping San, which is the very densely built up area between the Munmo Temple and the Donghua Hospital. Around here. Chadwick hasn't labelled East Street on his map, and at first glance it seems to have disappeared from the modern map as well. but it is in fact here. We've got a Tung Street and a Sai Street, Donggai and Saigai, which means East Street and West Street in Chinese. You can see the building is much taller than the one over on Kaiming Lane, perhaps because they were a more modern design. As Chadwick noted, these were newly built and not yet fully occupied. The ground here is sloping. It's a sloping hillside. The building is cut into that hillside, so the back of the lane does have an opening, but the front here facing to East Street is cut into the hillside, making it very, very, very dark. He says you have to be careful not to trip over when you're inside there. Now, when Chadwick visited, there were already cabins in the basement and on the first floor, and indeed the cockloft had already been set up, and that was split up as well into these 3 little cabins here. He spots that there are these double layers of windows here. So although the cockloft seemed to be a sort of a later addition, he said that it was clearly planned for when they built the building, just by the fact that there's these double windows here. Chadwick reported 80 people living in one of these buildings, and the ground floor here with its cockloft was the most crowded of all. It was split into 14 rooms and home to 41 people. Other plans in his report show more buildings from around Taiping Shan. This one's on Tank Lane. We've got one from Station Street, one from Market Street, Kane Road, Taiping Shan Street, and then a section from Wellington Street on the left right up to Gough Street on the right. I'll put links to the document in the description in case you'd like to explore these in more detail. Chadwick starts part 2 of his report by stating his goals as a sanitary engineer. He says he wants to give Hong Kong's inhabitants pure air, pure water and light, and to take away all organic waste before it has a chance to rot and contaminate the water in drinking wells or the air. So the plans of the houses we just saw were part of his conversation about providing air and light. And now we'll turn to supplying the water and taking the waste away. So here's the section on water supplies. Chadwick found Hong Kongers were using a variety of water supplies. Most of the piped water at that time came from the Pot Phelan Reservoir, obviously still with us today. And there was also a smaller supply from what he called the Wong Na Chung Dam. I wasn't quite sure what he meant, but if we look back to his map, he's labelled it right down in the bottom corner, down here. So it was a dam on the stream that flows down into what we call Wong Nai Chung, or Happy Valley, down here. If we switch for a moment over to a later map, the 1901 map, the dam was still there, and it was called the Blue Pool. That's a more familiar name, and that gives its name to the Blue Pool Road today. Chadwick also found many wells in use as water supplies, and over here he takes samples from them. He says all the samples were turbid, so cloudy, and most of them very much so, but if you gave them a bit of time, they settled down and the water was very clear. Here's some of the things he tests the water for. Curiously, he tests the smell. Does the water have a smell? And then he does various chemical analyses here. But you'll see a very important thing he doesn't do. He doesn't test for any bacteria, which is probably the most important thing. You know, is the water going to make you sick? Does it have typhoid bacteria? Does it have cholera bacteria? We'll see later on in this that we'll have to wait a few years before we'll get an answer to those questions. Next then, we'll take a closer look at the sewers in Hong Kong and also answer a question that was asked on the recent video about Pottinger Street. Remember this one from a few months back? And down in the comments, viewer Kathy Cass 1 says, with those steep streets and the precipitous slopes above them, I often wonder how the civic authorities such as the Public Works Department coped with the provision of rainwater drainage, especially for those times of bad weather such as typhoons? Well, happily, Chadwick has the answer for us. Over here on point 66, he describes the situation. He says the public sewers appear to have been made rather as drains to carry off storm water than as sewers to remove from habitations the foul waters usually known as sewage. Neither their form nor their construction is that which is considered desirable for the latter purpose. They do not appear to have been made on any general plan, but rather to have been constructed from time to time as the necessity arose, and they seem to have been designed to convey the storm waters and perennial flow from the ravines above and the surface water of the streets and houses by the shortest and most direct line to the harbour, into which they discharge their contents through large openings in the wharf wall. The inverts of these outlets are at about the level of low water ordinary spring tides. They're not provided with tide flaps. With few exceptions, no attempt has been made to carry out the effluent below low water mark, nor to select positions for outfalls where a strong tidal stream would remove it. Consequently, deposit takes place at their mouths, and hence at low tide there is a most offensive smell along the whole harbour front. We can see what he means if we look at the map again. Let's come back over to the western section. So these are the streams in the ravines that he was talking about, and you'll see that many of them end up flowing into what were originally built as drains, he says, and have now become used as the sewers. And everything ends up washing into the harbour down here. All of the red lines flow down to the harbour. Now, later photos show that many of those early sewers weren't able to cope with the worst of Hong Kong's rainstorms, and so would burst open and have to be rebuilt. Got one example with some pictures. So this is the stream coming down the Glenealy Nullah, and that ends up in a sewer which runs down along Wyndham Street, along Pedder Street, and then out into the harbour. Now in 1889, 7 years after this map was drawn, there was a very heavy rainstorm which caused a lot of damage, and that was captured in several photos. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. So this is the upper section, the Glenealy Ravine. You can see the stream bed has been ripped off. Coming down the hill, we come to Wyndham Street. And this is probably worst of all. It just seems to have burst through the roof of the sewer, and the whole road surface has been damaged here. Down at the bottom of the hill, down on Pedder Street, you see the results of all that. So we've got the post office on the left, clock tower on the right. We're standing on Queen's Road. We're looking north towards the shoreline, which would be Devoe Road today. And Pedder Street is just a stream running through between all of the mud that's come pushed down from the hillside. You can see they've had to put a little bridge over that here for pedestrians. So to answer the question, drains were built to carry away the flow from streams and the runoff from the rainfall, but the builders of those early drains really didn't know just how much water they'd have to deal with. And so in Hong Kong's heaviest rainstorms, the drains would often burst, and then they would be rebuilt sort of bigger and better. And then as time passed, those drains were also pressed into use as Hong Kong's sewers. Now Chadwick tells us that having all those sewers empty out onto the beach, and we saw that on the map here, so empty out onto the beach beyond the wharf, caused the most offensive smell, but it really could have been a lot worse, because in 1882 only a tiny amount of the night soil, which was the polite term for human urine and feces, that was produced every day ever reached Hong Kong's sewers, because only a very small number of Hong Kong's houses had water closets installed. And most of those houses belonged to the wealthier Europeans, so the bulk of Hong Kong's population never saw a flushing toilet. Instead, the women and children used a pot kept under their bed, while men visited one of the latrines. Now remember, Chadwick was careful to mark the location of the latrines. There's quite a cluster of them here over in Taiping Shan. It's the L in a circle. And he also included them in his collection of sketches. So not just any sketch, but colourful this time as well. And he's given us 3 to admire. So you can choose between the modified bucket system, or the trough system, or head a little bit to the north and try out the Canton system. So 3 different styles of latrine to choose from. Now, after you'd used a pot or visited the latrine, what happened next? Well, every night the night soil was collected from the house's pots and from the latrines around the city and taken to boats that were waiting at the seafront, and they carried it around to Lapsap Wan, or Rubbish Bay, which, as you'd expect, was over at the far end of the city. So Lapsap Wan was just around here. This is roughly the end of Queen's Road West, just here. Sekthong Choi and Kennedy Town off down here. The night soil then, when it got to the bay here, it was transferred onto junks that would take it away to China, where it was sold as fertilizer. And the report goes into lots more detail about that. So for example, if you used a pot or a pail at home, you'd have to pay a local labourer to come and empty it out on a regular basis. And it seems at the time you had a choice. You could pay for a daily service, an alternate daily service, or just twice a week, depending on what you could afford. And again, I'll put a link to the full document in the description below for that. Now, after Chadwick's thorough report on the current state of sanitation, he turns to his recommendation for how to make things better. He had strong words for the government about the water supply, telling them to abandon the present barbarous and dangerous intermittent supply. Now, at that time, the water supply was only turned on for several hours a day, but Chadwick wanted it available 24/7. As far as dealing with human waste, he has a clear preference for it to be flushed away into a sewer rather than carried away in a bucket. Turning to housing, his strongest comments are on the need to improve the drains in Hong Kong's houses, work that he says should be undertaken at once. He wanted to see less overcrowding within the buildings and greater space around them to improve ventilation. In particular, he wanted to have open alleys at the back of buildings rather than building houses back to back like we saw on Kaiming Lane. The alleys would give the space to lay drains and so avoid having to run those drains under buildings, and of course they'd help with ventilation too. There should be no more earth floors. Ground floors should be made of tiles laid in concrete. And finally, he wanted each habitable room to have an outside window to give people fresh air. Now, if you follow his plans, the better drains and the use of flushing toilets would increase the amount of sewage flowing into the sewers. And to avoid all that ending up on the shore of the city, he recommended building an intercepting sewer running parallel to the seafront. So the idea is that would run along here, intercepting all of the flow from these smaller sewers and carrying it off somewhere out here. He ran a series of experiments to work out where was the best place to put it into the sea. Here's one of his charts. There's several charts like this. And at the end of his experiments, he compiled them into this single view. And he says, well, you might think you'd put it at the western end of the city. That would be the closest. So your intercepting sewer runs along here and pours everything out into the harbour here. And that works well when the tide is rising. It gets swept away here. Unfortunately, as the tide falls, it all gets washed back straight in front of the city again. So he said what you needed to do was carry it around here to Sulphur Channel. So that's between Hong Kong Island and Green Island. And then as the tide's rising, anything that you put in the water gets sent up this way. And as the tide's falling, it gets washed away down here. But in either case, it stays clear of the city. His final recommendation wasn't related to sanitary engineering work at all. Instead, he wanted to see the new position of sanitary officer created. This was a person who would work with the existing district watchman to educate Hong Kong's population about the new sanitary ordinances Chadwick expected to see introduced and to enforce them if necessary. The government's response to Chadwick's report? Well, it varied. Hong Kong wouldn't see those intercepting sewers built until after the Second World War, and residents of Hong Kong's modern coffin homes are still waiting for their outside windows. But one early success was the appointment of a sanitary officer, although it was actually called a sanitary inspector. So here we are, government notification, the year after Chadwick's report, 1883, and it's announcing the creation of a sanitary board, and one of those members of the board would be the new sanitary inspector, Mr Hugh McCallum. You can see just a small organisation at the time. It's just him and a handful of people, but it would grow and grow, and it would eventually grow into what we know as the Urban Council. Now, before we wrap up, I wonder if we can work out where Osbert Chadwick stood on the big question of what caused disease. As at the time he's writing this report, there's really a revolution going on in our understanding of the causes of disease. So if you just roll back just a few decades, it was almost universally understood that disease was the result of breathing in foul-smelling air, either from people who were ill or that rose up from decomposing matter. And this was known as the miasma theory of disease, and it had been the accepted explanation for centuries, really. Here's another Chadwick who was a strong believer of the miasma theory, Edwin Chadwick, who in 1846 told a parliamentary committee that all smell is disease. Now, this Edwin Chadwick was Osbert's father. But in 1854, this gentleman, John Snow, made a great breakthrough during a cholera epidemic in London when he proved that cholera wasn't spread by foul air at all, but instead by contaminated water, and he was further able to show that cholera spread when the water was contaminated by human sewage, though he didn't know what it was in the sewage that actually caused the illness. Now, sadly, Snow died in 1858, having seen his findings rejected, really. People didn't believe what he'd found. They were only widely accepted after another cholera epidemic in 1866 proved him to be completely right. So Snow's work then was an important step towards proving germ theory as the main cause of disease. Louis Pasteur took it further, and then in 1884 Robert Koch identifies the bacteria Vibrio cholerae as the cause of cholera. So looking at Chadwick's report again, his many mentions of the dangers of noxious vapours and the fact that his analysis of well water has a column for smell makes me think he hasn't quite lost his father's belief in the miasma theory. As further confirmation, he specifically identifies damp floors in underground basements as causing malaria. However, he also stresses avoiding contaminating wells, which I think shows he accepted John Snow's work. And later in his report, he does mention Pasteur's work on germs too, so he was at least aware of the new theories of disease. And finally, there's also the chance that he was tailoring his writing to match his audience, because the miasma theory was still very widely believed in Hong Kong. And for several decades after this report comes out, the cause of malaria was still explained as the infectious gases given off by the local soils, in particular the decomposed granite that is widespread in Hong Kong. Well, we've just scratched the surface of Chadwick's report, so if it's something in here that you find interesting, I encourage you to read the full document. Again, I'll link to that below. And just before we leave, for any viewers who can read Chinese, I'd just like to take a moment to introduce the Chinese translation of my first book, Volume 1 of Old Hong Kong Photos and the Tales They Tell. So this translation was launched just last week at the Hong Kong Book Fair, I'll put a link below to the online bookstore if you'd like to order a copy. And if you order in July, there's a special launch offer of 20% off the regular list price. And that ends the video. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.